Hi, everyone. Our subject this time around is the late Romantic era, basically the second half of the 19th century, 1840 or 50 or so, up till around 1900. Remember that there are not distinct timelines for each of these phases of development of Western art music or Western art in general. They overlap one another more and more as time goes by and as artistic production becomes more diverse. The reason that it becomes more diverse is because there is a more diverse audience for the arts. More people are able to patronize the arts, to go to exhibitions or to go to concerts, opera performances, to commission works of art, painting, sculpture, pieces of music, that sort of thing. So there is great diversity in this music. Some composers from this time period are traditionalists. They write music that uses the basic elements in the way that it was used in the earlier Romantic era, or even going back to the classical era. At the same time, there are other composers who, working with these same elements, push music forward to make it basically a more complex, more involved listening experience. The audience for that was smaller, but these composers are significant because they wrote great music, but also because their work influenced composers to come later on, as you'll be reading about next week when the text comes to the music of the 20th century. So, as you can see here, the same sources of inspiration are still applying, even as we come forward into the later part of the Romantic era. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of these innovators, Liszt, Wagner, and Schoenberg. But I'd like to spend some time with the terms on the lesson notes for today as we go along. Leitmotif is just a theme, a melody, a bit of melody that can be associated with a person. You'll remember in the Gold Rush, the Charlie Chaplin film you watched a couple of months ago, there were themes for each of the characters. And basically they just sort of gave you a feel of the character of each of those people in the drama. Leitmotif is a little more involved. It can represent a person or a thing or an abstract idea. For example, the love theme from Casablanca. The composer for that movie, Max Steiner, was schooled in the music of some of these composers who I am speaking about now, and he used this idea, the concept of leitmotif, in fleshing out the score to that movie and his many other movie scores. Franz Liszt, great virtuoso, a great celebrity, was one of the main attractions all around Europe during his long life. An amazing pianist and a composer of very progressive sounding music. He's credited with the development of the genre of the tone poem, which I've spoken about before, a one-movement work for orchestra, where these leitmotifs are used to represent the various things that I've just spoken about. There's a steady flow of music and more progressive harmony. During this time period, all of the elements of music become more complex. That continues to happen into the beginning of the 20th century, as you will be reading. But this is a development that's very consistent through this time period. So, Richard Wagner, a hugely important figure in 19th century music. He composed opera. He called them music dramas. He expanded the use of this leitmotif idea. He was Liszt's son-in-law. The text speaks about him. He's a profoundly important figure. His music cast a very long shadow over musicians coming 2 and even 3 generations after his time. So some of the terms: nationalism, as monarchies are overthrown and more and more countries in Europe have representative governments, sense of national identity becomes more and more pronounced. That is reflected in the arts, as in music as well. Some of the compositions that fall into this category would use folk tunes as thematic material. You saw that with Tchaikovsky and his 1812 overture. A very important composer, Richard Strauss. You can see he lived quite a while through the first half of the 20th century. Very prolific composer, wrote a huge amount of very virtuosic, beautiful sounding music in many different genres. He wrote tone poems. He wrote opera, he wrote chamber music and concertos, all very wonderful music. Gustav Mahler, shorter lifespan, but composed mostly symphonic music, although he wrote some song cycles as well. Let's see. Yes, the form that he used is more classical in scope, but he incorporated some of the complexities of Wagnerian ideas into his music, along with folk elements, a little bit of nationalism thrown in as well. A development that occurs during this time period, mostly in art, but also in poetry, literature, and music as well, is Impressionism. So this is about something relating to creating the impression of something rather than an exact replica of it. So paintings by Monet and the other French Impressionists really spurred this artistic movement. Lots of very, very beautiful art. As I said, painting, sculpture, music, poetry was produced in this type of art form, Impressionism. The work of Sigmund Freud, we touched on this briefly with the Schoenberg piece that you listened to already, the Premonitions from his 5 orchestral pieces. His writings about the subconscious and its effect on emotion and behavior has a huge effect on artistic production at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. A good term for you to remember is avant-garde, new or unusual experimental ideas, or you could just talk about the avant-garde. That would mean a group of artists creating art that falls into this category. Here's Arnold Schoenberg. You'll read some about him in the text. You see, likewise, end of the 19th century through the middle of the 20th century, he carries on the Wagnerian harmonic tradition and continues developing things in more and more complex ways. The harmony becomes so complex that finally it reaches a point of atonality, where there's no specific key area to ground you as a listener in what you're hearing. Schoenberg went on to develop what he called a 12-tone system. Remember that there are 12 tones in the chromatic scale. Schoenberg came up with formulas for generating melody and harmony, and then consequently form, based on using all 12 of the tones. He came up with a system of rules for doing this. This is very significant because it allowed composers to create things in a predetermined way. They wouldn't necessarily have to be inspired by anything in particular. You could just plug in formulas to generate these elements of a composition. And composers continued to do that for quite some time. He further organized the composition of music by going with serial music, which had formulas for developing other basic elements of music as well. This carried forward so long that there were many composers writing this style of music actually when I was in school, which is quite some time ago, but definitely in the 20th century. So, today's assignment, move ahead in the textbook. Chapter 13 actually deals with music of the 20th century. So you should do the NT assignment. Do that first. Finish up with the Romantic era. Then go on and study Chapter 13 and work on TH13, the questions that go along with that as well. Your listening in NT 13 for this time around will include music by Wagner, some very beautiful music, an overture or prelude to one of his operas, and a little bit more music by Schoenberg, which I think you'll find very different, if nothing else. Hopefully enjoyable to listen to, or at least very interesting to listen to. So that's it for this time around. Please remember that over the break and going into the end of the semester, this might be a great opportunity for you to write some concert reports to boost your grade point total. If you feel that you need to do that, this should be a real good time to add that into your work to develop your grade in the class. Happy listening to this music, and I'll speak to you again very soon.